The message came in at 11:41 on a Tuesday night, while I was folding laundry that didn't belong to anyone waiting up for it. New DNA match. Parent-child relationship, 99.1% probability. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding one of my own socks, and read it 4 times before the words agreed to mean what they meant. My name is Rachel Sanders, and I've been a paralegal at Mitchell and Coleman for 14 years. I spend my days pulling probate filings, chasing down notary seals that don't match county records, and building the kind of paper trail that holds up when a family finally decides to stop pretending it agrees with itself. I'm good at it because I don't get emotional about documents. A document either says what it says or it doesn't, and my job is to find the ones that do. I learned that skill, though I didn't know it at the time, in a hospital room in Millbrook 21 years ago, watching my mother make a decision for me while I was too weak from delivery to argue with her. I was 17. The boy I'd been seeing that spring had already moved to his uncle's place 2 counties over by the time I started showing, and my mother, Donna Sanders, decided within about a week of finding out that this was not going to be a story anyone in Millbrook ever heard. My father, Carl, went along with it the way he went along with most of Donna's decisions, not because he agreed exactly, but because disagreeing with my mother took a kind of stamina he'd stopped having sometime in the 90s. She told the neighbors I was spending the fall semester with her sister in Columbus, catching up on credits. She told the church I was studying. She told everyone a version of events with just enough truth in it that nobody thought to check, and I went along with it because I was 17 and scared, and because the alternative she offered, that I could try to keep the baby and she would no longer help pay for anything, including community college the following year, was not really an alternative at all. 3 weeks before I went into labor, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table with a legal pad, going over what she called the plan like it was a grocery list. She had already contacted an agency 2 hours away, one that handled placements quietly and didn't require a lot of paperwork with the county. "This is not a discussion," she told me, when I tried to ask whether I could at least meet the family first. "This is what's happening. You will not ruin this family's name over a mistake." I didn't argue. I had learned by then that arguing with my mother just extended the conversation. It never changed the outcome. About 2 weeks before the due date, I asked if I could at least write to the boy and tell him when it happened, so it wouldn't just show up somewhere in his life as a rumor. My mother said that was not going to happen, that involving another 17-year-old in a decision that's already made would only spread the story to one more household, and one more household was one too many. I never told him. I've thought, more than once since, about whether he ever wondered, and I've decided that's a question I don't get to ask on his behalf. I gave birth on a Thursday in December, in a hospital 40 minutes from home, so no one in Millbrook would see the paperwork. My mother sat in the chair by the window the entire time, not holding my hand, just watching the door. When the nurse asked if I wanted to hold the baby before the agency representative arrived, my mother answered for me. "That won't be necessary," she said. "It'll only make it harder." I signed the relinquishment papers 9 hours after delivery, while I was still bleeding through the second pad they'd given me, my hand shaking badly enough that the notary, a woman I never saw again, had to steady the clipboard for me. I didn't know until years later, working in this exact field, that most states require a waiting period after delivery before that signature is legally solid, and that 9 hours doesn't come close to satisfying it in most places. At the time, I only knew that my mother stood up the second I finished signing and said, "Good. Now we can go home and put this behind us." We drove back to Millbrook 2 days later. My mother had already told everyone I'd come home early from Columbus with Mono. I went back to school in January thinner and quieter than I'd left, and nobody asked me anything because my mother had made sure there was nothing to ask. For years, I told myself she had done something cruel out of something that resembled love, that she was protecting the family, protecting me, protecting a version of my future she thought I couldn't see yet from inside a bad year. I built a whole architecture of forgiveness around that idea, brick by brick, because the alternative was believing my mother had simply decided my daughter was a liability to be managed, and I wasn't ready to live inside that belief for a long time. The town believed the miscarriage story completely, which was its own kind of education in how easily people accept a sad thing they don't have to look at too closely. Casserole dishes showed up on our porch for 2 weeks, chicken and rice, a lasagna from someone at the church, a card signed by 6 women from my mother's book club, and my mother accepted every one of them at the door with the exact right amount of quiet grief in her voice, then closed the door and told me to go finish my homework. I sat upstairs eating cold lasagna off a paper plate, 4 days after giving a baby to strangers I'd never met, listening to my mother's voice carry warmly up the stairwell as she thanked one more neighbor for her thoughtfulness. On my 25th birthday, I asked her once, at this same kitchen table, if she ever thought about where the baby had gone. She didn't look up from her crossword. "That child is not something we discuss in this house," she said, and underlined a word like the sentence was already finished. That was the last time I asked out loud for 13 years. I built a career instead. I got a paralegal certificate at night while working the front desk at a title company during the day, and eventually Henry Mitchell, who ran the firm I still work for, hired me off a filing I'd flagged as fraudulent on my 3rd week as a temp, a deed with a notary stamp that didn't exist in the county database. Henry likes to say I have a nose for paper that's lying. I've always known exactly where I learned to smell it. The night the DNA notification came through, I hadn't taken the test looking for anything. I'd done it 18 months earlier out of idle curiosity, the way you do those things at 40% off during a holiday sale, and mostly forgotten about it. But a message that says 99.1% probability of a parent-child relationship doesn't leave room for idle curiosity anymore. My hands went cold before my brain caught up to what I was looking at. I sat on the edge of the bed for 11 minutes. I checked the clock before and after, before I opened the profile attached to the match. Her name was Amber Grant, 21 years old. A profile photo of her kneeling next to a golden retriever in scrubs, laughing at something outside the frame. Under reason for testing, she'd written, family medical history, my dad's heart. I read that line more times than the percentage. Somewhere in Ohio, a man who wasn't my daughter's father by blood was sick enough that she'd gone looking for a piece of medical history that led straight back to me. And I hadn't known either of them existed in any real way for 21 years. I didn't message her that night. I didn't message her for 3 more days because I have spent my whole professional life learning that the worst thing you can do with a piece of information that matters is act on it before you understand exactly what it is. So I did what I do at work. I verified. The adoption agency my mother had used, 2 hours from Millbrook, had closed in 2011, its records folded into a state archive, so that's where I started. I filed a records request under the state's adult adoptee statute, the one that allows an adoptee over 18 to request their own original birth certificate. Unsealed, no court order required. A law that had only taken effect 9 years earlier and that my mother, I was fairly sure, had no idea existed. I didn't file it as Amber's mother. I filed it quietly as a paralegal helping a client navigate a records request, using my own professional credentials to move it through faster than it would have gone otherwise. Henry noticed the file open on my desk one afternoon and asked, mildly, whether it was for a case. I told him it was personal, and he didn't push, which is one of the reasons I've stayed at that firm for 14 years. My parents heard none of it. I sat across from my mother at Sunday dinner 3 separate times that month, passed her the green beans, listened to her talk about the Heritage Society's spring luncheon, and said nothing about the fact that I had spent that same week on the phone with a records clerk in Columbus confirming a hospital discharge date. I made small talk about my father's blood pressure medication while carrying, underneath it, the full weight of a birth certificate request that would, if it came back the way I expected, prove that my mother had told a specific, detailed lie to an entire town for 2 decades. There was one Tuesday night, about 3 weeks in, when Amber sent a message asking if I wanted to talk on the phone instead of texting, and I sat with my thumb over the call button for 11 minutes before I put the phone face down on the counter and made myself finish cooking dinner first. I nearly called my mother that same night, just to hear what she'd say if I asked the question straight out. I didn't. I had learned a long time ago that you don't tip your hand before you know what's in the other one. I thought more than once about confronting her directly, the day the DNA match came in, before I'd verified anything. Some early, unpracticed part of me wanted to drive to my parents' house that same night and lay the phone on the table. I didn't, because I have watched enough contested estates fall apart in front of a judge to know what happens when someone leads with feeling before they lead with proof. The other side simply says it isn't true, and there's nothing left to hold them to. I decided, somewhere around midnight that first night, that I would gather everything first and give her nowhere to stand before I ever said a word out loud. That decision cost me 3 weeks of sitting on information I badly wanted to say to the one person I most wanted to say it to, and there were nights it took everything I had not to pick up the phone. The original birth certificate arrived on a Thursday in a state envelope 11 days after the DNA match. It listed my name correctly as the mother. It listed the hospital, the delivery date, and this was the part that made my hands go cold a second time, a signature line for a witness present at the relinquishment signing, dated the same afternoon I'd signed, 9 hours after delivery. My mother's signature was on it, not a court officer, not an agency representative. My mother had witnessed her own coercion and signed her name to the record of it, then spent 21 years telling a room full of people I'd had a miscarriage in Columbus. She had one piece of paper left to use against a story she'd spent 21 years defending, and she had been carrying it folded in her bag for 11 days, waiting for a room full enough to matter. Drop a comment if you've ever kept something folded that long, waiting for the right room. The room I chose was the Millbrook Heritage Society's Spring Gala, held the third Saturday in June at the Community Center on Route 9, 200 guests in folding chairs under strings of white lights, because that was the room my mother had chosen first. She was receiving the Cornerstone Award that year, given annually to the Millbrook resident judge to have done the most to preserve, as the program put it, the values and history of this community. She had chaired the Society's board for 11 years. She had personally selected the citation language for her own plaque, which described her as a woman who had modeled integrity for 2 generations of Millbrook families. My father sat 2 tables from the front, in the gray suit he wore to every occasion that required one, clapping along with everyone else when the mayor called my mother's name. Amber sat beside me at a table near the back, in a blue dress she'd told me over the phone she almost didn't buy because it felt like too much for a stranger's town event. And Amanda Grant, her adoptive mother, sat on her other side, holding her hand under the table the way you hold the hand of someone whose whole life is about to reorganize itself in front of 200 witnesses. I had met Amanda twice by then, both times in her kitchen in Dayton, and both times she'd said some version of the same thing, that she had always told Amber her birth mother sounded, from the little the agency shared, like a girl who hadn't had a choice. She was right, and she was kind enough to be glad, rather than threatened, that the girl in that old file had a name and a face now. The mayor handed my mother the microphone. She thanked the board, thanked her wonderful husband, Carl, for 41 years of support, and said, into a microphone in front of 200 people, that this town had always told the truth about who it is and where it comes from. That was the sentence I stood up on. My chair scraped loud enough that heads turned 3 tables in either direction. I walked to the small standing microphone near the dessert table that the MC had used earlier for the raffle, and I asked, politely, if I could say a few words before the award was finalized. The mayor, caught off guard, looked at my mother, who nodded, she thought, I'm almost certain, that I was about to say something warm about her, the kind of thing daughters say at these events. I read the date off the birth certificate first, out loud, plainly, the way I'd read 100 documents into 100 records over 14 years. I read the hospital name. I read my own name in the mother's line. Then I read the witness line and my mother's signature under it, dated the same day, 9 hours after delivery. The room went quiet in a specific way I've only heard a handful of times since, in courtrooms, when a piece of paper does more work than a lawyer's whole closing argument. My mother's face didn't collapse right away. It went through something more like recalibration first, the expression of a woman running the same excuse through several versions in under 3 seconds, looking for the one that would still work in front of this many people. Rachel, she said, into a silence loud enough that her voice cracked on the second syllable. This isn't the place. You picked the room, Mom, I said. I just brought the paper. Then I turned toward the back table and asked Amber to stand up, and she did, in her blue dress, next to Amanda, in front of 200 people who had just spent an hour watching my mother accept an award for honesty. My father stood up before my mother said another word. He didn't say anything either at first. He just walked the length of the room, past his own table, past the head table where his wife was still holding a plaque. Nobody was going to let her keep now, and put his hand on my shoulder. And then, after a long moment, on Amber's. Later he told me he'd known something was wrong for 11 days, ever since I'd started leaving Sunday dinner early with vague excuses, and that some part of him had been waiting for the floor to open. He hadn't known what my mother had done in that hospital room. He'd believed, all these years, the miscarriage story, the same as everyone else. She had lied to him too, and something in his face that night made it clear he understood, all at once, exactly how long she'd been managing him along with the rest of the town. The Heritage Society rescinded the award before the dessert course was cleared. The board chair called an emergency session the following Tuesday and voted 7-0 to remove my mother from the board entirely, citing conduct inconsistent with the values the society exists to represent, language pulled almost word for word from the citation she'd written for her own plaque. 3 of the 7 board members had been in the room that night. The other 4 had heard about it from someone who was. Within a month, the spring luncheon committee had quietly replaced her name on every piece of stationery the society still had in print. Word moves fast in a town of 4,000 people. By the following weekend, 3 women from my mother's book club had called me directly, not to defend her, but to say some version of the same thing, that they'd always thought the miscarriage story felt a little too smooth, a little too quickly finished, and that they were sorry they'd never asked harder questions at the time. My mother, for her part, stopped coming to the grocery store on Saturday mornings when the store is busiest and started going on Tuesday afternoons instead when almost no one she knows is there. I didn't take any pleasure in that particular detail when I heard it. I noted it, the way I note everything, and moved on to the next line. My father moved into the guest room 2 days after the gala and filed for legal separation 6 weeks after that. He told me, over coffee at a diner outside town, where he was fairly sure no one from the Heritage Society crowd would recognize him, that he wasn't leaving because of the baby. He kept calling her that. The baby. Even though she was sitting a county away being a 21-year-old veterinary technician with her own apartment and her own opinions about golden retrievers. He was leaving because he'd spent 41 years married to someone who had decided once. That lying to him was more efficient than telling him the truth, and he couldn't find a version of the marriage that survived learning that. My mother stopped attending church the same month. The pastor told my father, who told me, that she'd said she needed some time, which in Millbrook is the polite way of saying everyone in the sanctuary already knows. There was money, too, though I almost didn't go looking for it. My grandparents, my mother's own parents, had set aside an education trust in my name when I was born, $38,000, meant to be released to me at 25. My mother had controlled it as trustee and had simply never told me it existed, letting me pay my own way through night classes for a paralegal certificate while she sat on money that was legally mine. Henry helped me file the paperwork to force an accounting once the birth certificate had already cracked everything else open, and the bank released the funds 4 months later, with interest, $39,400 in total. I put half of it toward Amber's veterinary school application fees, not because she needed rescuing, but because I wanted, once in my life, to be the one deciding what happened to money that had my name on it. Amber and I don't talk every day. We talk most Sundays on the phone, and every 3rd weekend or so I drive the 2 hours to Dayton and we get lunch somewhere Amanda recommends, and some of those lunches are easy, and some of them are quiet in a way that still has 21 years of distance folded into it. She asked me once, over fries at a diner near her apartment, whether I hated my mother. I told her I didn't have room left for hate. I'd spent most of my hating years just getting through Tuesdays. What I have instead is something more like an accounting, a long list of exactly what was taken, and when, kept the way I keep every other record, precise and unsentimental, closed out the day the truth finally matched the paperwork. I still carry some of it. There are 21 birthdays I wasn't in the room for, and no amount of Sunday phone calls fills in a childhood I only know now from photographs Amanda has started sending me, a gap tooth at 6, a soccer trophy at 9, a hospital bracelet from a broken arm at 13 that nobody called me about, because there was no reason anyone would have. Amber and I have started, carefully, filling in some of the smaller gaps instead of grieving the big one. She's taught me the names of 3 different dog breeds I couldn't previously tell apart. I've told her, finally, in full, what her father looked like, and that he never got the letter I wasn't allowed to send. Donna always said silence kept a family together. I know now it only kept one version of it standing, the one where nobody asked questions. My family got bigger the day I stopped keeping hers. My father comes to dinner most Fridays now, at my place, and he's slowly learning to make small talk with a granddaughter he didn't know he had until she was 21, which is its own kind of quiet work, the same patient sort I spent 2 decades practicing without knowing what it was for. Last Friday, Amber left her keys on my kitchen counter by accident and had to drive back for them after she'd already pulled out of the driveway. I heard the gravel under her tires twice in one evening, once leaving and once coming back, and I stood at the window both times and watched her, the second time smiling at herself for forgetting, and I thought about how ordinary it was, how completely unremarkable a sound a car makes on gravel, and how long I had gone without anything in my life ordinary enough to make that particular noise mean something.